Time Capsule. Today, my guest is
Craig Hall.
public speaker and living historian. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Craig Hall?
Well, Cheryl, I grew up in a Midwestern town, and I was very interested in history from the time I was in high school. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a teaching degree, studying American institutions in history. I taught school for about a semester before I went to service. I was in the Army, served in various units that were attached to and supported the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in the Pentagon. And afterwards, I went to law school. After law school, I worked for the government for a number of years, and then as inside counsel for a number of corporations. I retired about 10 years ago. But of 35 or more of those years, I was in the reenactment hobby, the living history hobby. And as I say to many people, I graduated from being a reenactor to a living historian. And I do various military impressions, including those involving the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, and Vietnam. And basically that's kind of, I suppose, why I'm here today.
So you made a distinction between living history and reenacting. So what is the difference?
Well, reenacting basically is with a number of individuals who come together in some venue, and they're dressed in the period of the time. They're dressed in the right uniforms, they have the right equipment, they have the right weapons, they have tents and the camps are all set up, they may have vehicles depending on the particular period of time that you're doing, and they reenact. They reenact a battle in many cases. You're talking about a battle. Other cases, they just do reenactments of different kinds of camp life, like a mail call or something like that. And then a lot of people in the hobby, as we call it, I think they feel they're doing living history because of the fact that they're dressed like that. And they are there and the people can see them and they think that because they're walking around doing this, that's living history. But I'm very opinionated about it. I believe that living history is educational. And I believe that if you don't do an educational role or an educational demonstration that informs the public about the history of the period, that you're really not doing living history. And that's the distinction that I see.
Very good. So why don't we take a look now at what a reenactment actually is. This was done at the reenactment of the Battle of Gettysburg in 2019. Let's take a look. cavalry.
All of it's there, all of it's there,
Okay,
yeah.
very good, very good. So now typically, where do these reenactments and living history demonstrations take place? Because obviously Gettysburg is a big one.
Well, just take that as for example, the local farmer's field is where you do a lot of these things. They have reenactments at local and state parks. I've done reenactments at colleges and universities on campuses and things like that. In terms of the living history demonstrations, I mean, in my case, I actually do demonstrations for various social groups where I'm just one individual providing the demonstration, the living history demonstration to them, retirement homes, and various venues like that.
So again, I have to go because this is not a cheap hobby, and it's time intensive, labor intensive. It's like you're dressing up in your Sunday best and going camping in the heat and the cold. So my question would be, why? Why do you do this?
Well, obviously, I think the answer was history. As I said, my interest in history started in high school, and it's always been there. And I think most reenactors and most living historians are there because they're interested in history and they want to convey that history to the public. But let's be honest, it's also a lot of fun. Okay, in one sense, in many cases, we're probably grown-ups with very expensive toys, and it's fun to go out and shoot your guns, you know, as they say. And so that's what we do sometimes. We just have to be realistic. But as I said, my goal, and I think most reenactors, we're in it because we love history, and we have a passion about conveying that history to the public.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we go ahead and take another look at what happened this year at the Gettysburg Annual Battle Reenactment. Let's take a look. So that's an example of another thing that a spectator, as we call the audience, might see at a typical battle reenactment. So my next question is, do any of these events actually occur at the National Historic Battlefield sites?
Well, unfortunately, on my mind, there aren't any reenactments. You'll never see a reenactment at a national battlefield site. There are a number of sites that do, in fact, provide for good living history. Some of them come to mind, for example, Harper's Ferry, doing Civil War. Coming up in next month at Eisenhower's Farm in Gettysburg, you're going to have a real World War II living history demonstration with lots of reenactors and living historians. And I used to do one, for example, at Valley Forge for the Revolutionary War. But normally what you get is a situation in which you're just doing living history. The Park Service is averse to having a reenactment, as some we've seen here in terms of the Gettysburg event, because primarily they're concerned about safety, they're concerned about the number of weapons and controlling those weapons, and they're very strict about those kind of rules. And so they might allow, for example, at some events, as we call them, at a park, they might allow a firing demonstration, but they're controlling the weapon, they control the munitions, and it's a very small, limited kind of portrayal.
Now typically, do you and the other reenactors or living historians get paid for doing any of this?
Well, unfortunately, we don't. For the vast majority of events that we attend, we wind up having to pay for our own participation. There are a few events where we do get paid, and demonstrations that I do at a number of locations, like, for example, The retirement homes that I attend, they pay me a stipend, if you will, for participating. But for the most part, no. We don't get paid. We're all volunteers, and we all spend our own money to project these images.
Right. So I guess that kind of would lead me to my next question, because, you know, for every sunshine there is a rainstorm. What do you think might be any bad aspects of reenacting?
Well, you know, one of the things we'll always have to be concerned about is safety. There have been, unfortunately, some instances in the past where individuals were injured in various different kinds of ways, in some cases through firearms that weren't adequately protected. So in most of reenactments, safety becomes a very important point, and it's the responsibility of the individual groups to ensure that there is safety. And unfortunately, for example, because of, I'll say, a failure maybe in terms of that process, one of the biggest reenactments that we had in World War II was at a military base. We mentioned before where, and there are sometimes military bases. I went onto an Air Force base in Wyoming, and in this instance, an individual was injured when the weapon that he was using went off, and he lost a finger. The other thing is the weather. I mean, you can go to one of these things and you spend a lot of money, and at Gettysburg, for example, this past year here, a storm came in and it just demolished our camp and our fly and our tents and those things. So we run into that kind of thing. And that's basically, I'll call it the bad elements of it.
But yeah, okay, yeah, so that storm at Gettysburg defined the storm of biblical proportions. I was there, so yes. So I guess, what kind of living history and reenactment demonstrations do the people in your group get involved in? Because you do many different eras.
Well, yeah, and when you say group, I'm really, I'm a member of a number of groups. So I'm a member, for example, of the Allied Airmen Preservation Society, John McCaskill, who was one of your previous guests. I'm a member of that group. There are also what I'll call immersion groups or tacticals. In other words, these are events that are done in certain locations where the different sides, if you will, of whatever period of military history they're portraying get together, and they're basically just playing war. They do it for the fun of it. There is no public participation, no public observes it. But in my mind, as I say, the most important ones are the ones where the public is involved. And I think if you don't have the public involvement, if you don't have an opportunity for living history that the public can learn from, that the public is being cheated out of a better time and a better opportunity to be able to come in and really see what's going on and learn from that event. For example, I do an impression at the Monmouth Courthouse, which is in New Jersey, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in the Revolutionary War. And it's a typical reenactment. The people go, they will see both sides, the British and the Americans, fighting out in the middle of a field, and they'll have their weapons and they're shooting at you. They're in the different lines. But most times they don't understand why. And so my goal, when I come there as a friend of the battlefield, is to set up my demonstration so that I explain to them why they're fighting the way they do. How the technology of the time generated the tactics and the strategy of the military forces. And so that, to me, is the most important part of, as I say, living history and reenactment.
And again, you know, you can talk about, and we can get to that later, but the difference between, say, a good and a bad impression, because it varies in degrees. There are people who, again, as you say, have wonderful what they call the junk on the bunk. You all call the junk on the bunk, which would be your shaving kit, your buttons, your Bible, anything to sort of give some insight into the character, into the person that you're portraying. And so this is done, you know, to various degrees in every way and in every era. So what, in your opinion, is the difference between a good and a bad impression?
Well, in my estimation, as long as you have what I'll call a reasonably good, accurate impression, we apply certain feet rules, like the 25 feet rule. If you look good from 25 feet, it's okay. It's a good impression. On the other hand, there are those who think that, you know, you really have to spend a lot of money and everything about you has to be as accurate as it possibly can, down to and including maybe your underwear. I don't know.
Or like the old 10, what was it, 10 stitches to the inch?
Yeah.
From which in the hobby we have derived the term.
And the point here is that what we're really interested in is we're teaching the public. And the public doesn't understand the ins and outs of trying to make something totally authentic and being so authentic that you immerse yourself. And in many cases, they, back to that question you had before, maybe something I should have mentioned, is like a time machine concept,
Mm-hmm.
that people really want to feel like they're reliving it and they're back in time.
Okay. So let's take a look at one very specific sort of impression. And speaking of authentic, let's take a look at this.
The Declaration of Independence by the RBE Library. The Revolutionary War broke out on April 19, 1775, and this was the war between the American colonists and England. By the time the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775 to discuss stronger action for independence, tensions in the American colonies ran very high. Colonists who did not wish to remain British subjects called themselves patriots, and those who remained faithful to England called themselves loyalists. On June 11, 1776, the Second Continental Congress met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they appointed a committee of 5 men to write a Declaration of Independence from England. Those 5 men were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft, and the committee declared it to be almost perfect. The committee presented the document to the Congress after making a few corrections, and following a few more changes, Thomas Jefferson's work was approved. Church bells rang out on July 4, 1776, the day the Declaration of Independence was adopted and our nation was officially born, when 56 members of the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence.
Well, welcome back to the Time Capsule. I'm here with my guest, living historian and former reenactor, Craig Hall. And let's go ahead and continue. So I guess, what would be the cost of becoming involved in this hobby?
Well, I would guess to be able to walk on the field, it kind of depends on what military impression or period you want to do. It's something in the area of about $1,000. And if you're going to be a reenactor and you're going to shoot a gun, your most expensive item is probably going to be that weapon. And those can be somewhere between $7,000 and $1,000 in themselves. And then the clothes themselves, even as I said before, with a reasonable impression, is probably going to be something in the area close to that. So, as I just spoke, maybe more than $1,000, maybe something like $2,000, to be honest with you.
And I can tell you, and again, the military impression is always going to be a little more expensive than the civilian impression. And as a woman, typically, I would be doing a civilian impression. And I can tell you the average Victorian woman wore between 5 and 7 layers. So don't think that that's all that cheap either. Now the good thing, and I'm sure the men find this too, is that when you get into this hobby, you start in a group and they have what they call the loaner gear. So people are more than willing to help you get started by giving you things that they already have. So there are ways into this that don't have to cost the proverbial arm and a leg. And it's just a question of, and I think you would agree, taking the time to kind of build your outfit after a while. So it can vary, from women also for $500 and up. And why don't we take a look at this? where do you get the clothing and the weapons and the accoutrement, if you like, to go ahead and participate in this hobby?
Well, I suppose like every other thing, on the internet, you have vendors or salespeople who are out there who produce this kind of material, everything from boxes to buttons to weapons to tents, and they're all there. You can get on the internet and do so. You can also go to these events, and at the events they have what we call sutlers, and they're really vendors, and they're there, they set up their tents and they bring their goods out and we go by. So as what I think you said before in another segment, you can never have enough stuff.
Oh, and you have not lived until you have walked down Sutler's Row at the Gettysburg reenactment and seen corsets and hoop skirts flapping in the breeze. Let's have a look at this.
All right.
So how do you become involved in a reenactment or living history group? Because I know you've been doing this for a long time. I, for one, as a relatively new reenactor, cannot imagine doing this before the internet. I mean, what, telephone? A letter? How did you do it?
Well, first of all, you got to decide what you want to do. You got to decide what period of history interests you the most. And then what I would suggest is that, again, you can go on the internet. You can look up various types of units. A lot of them have websites. They explain who they are. You contact them. And of course, you want to have something, that probably is in the area in which you live. And another way of doing it is the way I did it back in the day, as we call it. You go out to an event and you go and talk to people. And you find a group of people that you enjoy, that you think would be a good match for you, and that's the best way to start.
Because, and this is an important point, in terms of reenacting and living history, there again are varying degrees of what people like to call their authenticity meter. And so it's you sort of have to shop around. I mean, as much as they're shopping you, you're shopping them to find a match. Because if you're what they call a mainstream reenactor, an authentic group is not a good match. Well, we're going to go to break, but don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. And we're back with Craig Hall on the Time Capsule. So tell me, how are the reenactment and living history organized? How are these events organized in terms of a participation of an individual in this event?
Well, it kind of depends on the period of time. In most cases, you will have very well-organized events where you have to be a member of a group, a unit as they call it. The best example is what we call the Reading Air Show. In order to get to that, you have to register, you have to be on the list of the unit.
That's the World War II event.
To the organizers. On the other hand, there are smaller events where they're not that, shall we say, picky about who they invite, but they still imply that they're going to invite you. When it comes, for example, I got to say, when it comes to Revolutionary War, there's a group that's a major administrating function for both the British and the Americans, and you have to join a group and you have to come forward, you have to be vetted by them and be accepted by them in terms of both, what you're doing, your authenticity.
That's right. Now let me break you in here a minute, because I heard you say something about Revolutionary War. So can you tell me just real quick a little bit about your Revolutionary era impressions that you do?
Well, basically what I do is an impression of an individual, but I don't actually portray him, I just represent him. His name is William Koufax.
And who is he?
Well, he was a young man who came from Connecticut, and he joined General Washington's Life Guard at Valley Forge.
And the Life Guard, as I understand, was basically George Washington's Secret Service at the time.
Well, they were his security force. They were almost like the provost marshal in modern times in one sense. They guarded the commander-in-chief, and that's what it was called. And the whole point of that impression, if you will, is to discuss, as I discussed earlier, tell people about how and why the soldiers of the Revolutionary War fought, how General Washington was trying to develop an army, and how he went about doing that. And the individual, I don't portray much about his life, it's just that a set of events occurs where all of a sudden we now created an army out of the one that was on paper in 1775. And that's basically why I do that impression, to tell people why we fought, how we fought, and how we won that war.
And again, and I think we really could apply this to just about any living history impression. So that's a very good comprehensive overview, and that could pretty much apply to any living history impression. Well, we're going to take a break, but we'll be right back.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Out.
Well, welcome back to the Time Capsule. I want to thank Craig Hall very much for being my guest today. We enjoyed everything he had to say and look forward to seeing his impressions on and off the battlefield in the future. Well, that's it for Time Capsule. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.